Hi, I think what's coming up this morning to speak into vocal Tai Chi more is to kind of speak to the music and to the musician and to why I ended up in vocal Tai Chi and what it was that drew me that way um, as a creative. And I've spent quite a lot of time talking about it as a transformative modality for working with your stuff, with your healing, and with your holding of difficulties and making the voice something like an agent of change. And I've slightly downplayed the artistry and the musicianship of it because it feels a bit more specialized to talk about that. And actually, in the chapter that I've written that's coming out at the end of this year, I kind of hint at that when I talk about introducing vocal Tai Chi for the first time and how it came about that I performed it as vocal Tai Chi, and then I did a workshop because people said, teach me what you're doing, how you do that. I want to learn how to do that. So I get into the workshop space with 10 people and I'm thinking, well, what is drawing me to it is the raga alap, the subtle shades that I'm inspired by in the way that they are using a kind of contemplative sounding space and drawing on an exploration of the scale and its fine refinements and the ornamentation of the notes and the subtle shading and articulation of the notes. And I start this workshop and I suddenly sort of realize that's almost impossible to teach to this group of people who are here because they are moved by something in the energy of what I've done, but not really at a stage where they're going to be able to get the musicianship of it. So what happens is I sort of change gear mid-workshop, and instead of, I mean, I didn't even really have a plan. I just thought, well, they're here, they've come, they want to know. And it seemed suddenly obvious that I would need to return to the 4 floors of the vocal house from the voice movement therapy model, which is the Roy Hart Theatre, which is the Wolfson lineage. And that is going to give them an access to the energy that they see that is coming through in my performance, and that they want to capture a version of that for themselves in their energies. And there's no way we're going to get to the detail, the musical detail that I'm portraying in the way I improvise, because they haven't got the background and the training and the experience. And it's sad to have to say that, and I sort of keep brushing it under the carpet because I don't want people to feel, you know, that it's out of reach. I don't know how to teach that unless we get into a much more sort of technical and formal situation, which is sort of a less enjoyable process. You know, the workshops have always been a kind of a community building, empathic, emotionally releasing and joyous space, you know, and that's part of the power of the workshop. And becoming technical becomes sort of a bit more grey and boring. Maybe I'm completely wrong about that. You know, maybe people do want to sit and work on ornamentation and work on improving their ear and the scales and working on intervals and things. But you see, the thing is, for me, and this is the honest truth, I'm doing it unconsciously to some extent, and I'm guessing quite a lot of the time, and I'm playing, and I'm taking risks that don't always come off, and I'm not at a stage where I can kind of formalize a teaching technique around that level of detail, unless you want to start doing a kind of very, very, very old school style teaching technique, which is imitation, which I don't think is going to hold people's attention very long. So yeah, that's a kind of revelationary sort of statement, really, that I don't really teach how I sing. I teach a kind of energetic opening so that you can find what you can do within what your technical and your musical abilities and limits are. And I don't say limits in a pejorative sense at all, because I have a wonderful quote about limits from Stravinsky, who said, the composer will know he or she, I'm going to put the she in, is one when composing creates exact appetites in him, and in meeting and satisfying those exact appetites, he is aware of their exact limits. Now, there's something very sharply true about that. So it is a comment to consider. It is about precision, and it's about knowing what your edges are and working deeply and truly and thoroughly within the edges of your appetite. There is no boundless space. You have to find your edges, and then you can work within that. And even if you do punch into a boundless space for a moment, you're going to be coming right back down again afterwards. So how do you contain and work within limits that you set yourself and discover as you are working? It's, yeah, I don't know if that's really come across, but I'll have a listen back and see if it makes sense. Yeah, I've listened to that, and it seems, as far as it goes, to make sense. And I was also aware that there was a kind of a missing piece, so I want to try and bring that in. And it's so kind of difficult to cover all the bases when I'm talking about it. So the piece that was missing within the context of this thought stream on the artistry is that when I described it as being very precise and very subtle and nuanced, and it sounds like it's this sort of delicate, lacy kind of thing, and that's true, and it's also not true, because I do a mixture of the precision, and then I think somehow the precision kind of freaks me out at some point, and I just break it, and I do something that is more boundless, or more power releasing, and there seems to be this flow between wanting to look into the kind of formality of shaping something like a sort of almost statuesque form, and then kind of releasing that and kind of feeling into the build up of focused tension that's there, and just sort of releasing it in a more free form, energetic way, and then sort of softening back down into reconsidering and reapproaching those finer dialogues with the scale. So it's like I don't hold myself in a kind of in a trap of that. There's no traps. It's like I always can get myself out of any trap. So if I feel like I'm getting trapped, I just free up and then come back. And actually, when I was at the weekend, and I was talking to somebody, a music teacher, and she was very well informed about sort of natural voice scene in many of its sort of areas. She sort of, I think she's probably researching it or something, and she asked me this series of questions, and she got me to say something I'd never said before, which was that, you know, what I've got to a stage is that there is the whole sort of Wolfson, free the trauma, Roy Hart, theatricalize the voice movement therapy, work in a kind of almost clinical way with affect and voice. All that has kind of gone through, and that is about working with your stuff and making it artistic at the same time, but it is drawing on the stuff. And then there's also the bit that's the more sort of spiritual side. Well, I'm not saying that's not spiritual. That is total spiritual as well. Or whatever, forget the terms. The other side being, you know, working with the meditative, contemplative, drone, raga, toning, mantric, sort of silent sound relationship, ornamentation, detail. And so she got me to say something like, well, yeah, basically, you know, look at your trauma and then go through into a kind of more graced spiritual space. But don't just, you know, some people have gone straight for the sort of, you know, the work of, what's his name? Chris James, spiritual sounding work, and Chloe, of course, Chloe Goodchild, Gilles Petit, those people who I work with. And, you know, they are really honoring that very sacred space. But they don't inquire into the trauma. And then there is, you know, the Wolfson Roy Hart voice movement therapy that inquire into the trauma, but don't get as far as the sacred space. And then there's also this other community, which is the sort of Bobby McFerrin circle singing community, who are probably more akin to the natural voice community, and they're working with the joyful singing, and they're doing, you know, two different techniques to get to that place, the sort of joyous release, the sort of high of the ecstasy of harmony, the ecstasy of groove, and yeah, the kind of transcendence through the power of the form of the music as a harmonic structure, as a kind of looped groove, sort of perpetual mobile structure. And those forms hold the ecstasy, and people, you know, just sink into the ecstasy, and it becomes, somebody described it to me yesterday in an email, as being like a junkie for those highs. And so that's kind of almost avoiding the other sides of the human spectrum, not in a bad way, not in a judgmental way, but I'm just saying I haven't been able to sit in the transcendence and the ecstasy. I've needed to come into grounding and honesty with the human bit of me that's been wounded, and wanting to find use sound and voice as a mechanism towards meeting the wound, and believing now more and more truly in myself that inside that wound is you know, a way into the sacred. And that those two worlds, if you're going to say, put aside the natural voice and the Bobby McFerrin, the circle singing and the harmony singing, and coming to the work that I've done more constantly over the years, is working with the trauma release work, the clinical approach to the voice, to read the voice as a mirror of the psyche, and looking at the blocks and the difficulties of the human condition through sound, and then also calling on this sort of spiritual, meditative, mantric, contemplative, detailed, disciplined practice. I mean, it all requires discipline and hearing and listening, but perhaps most sophisticated in musical terms is the tradition of the raga alap and the raga, because of the history of it, and that there's this combination that seems to be mirroring, actually, some of the spiritual teachings that I'm now becoming interested in, so sort of post non-duality teachings, if that makes any sense. I've been reading a lot of books by Matt Licata, and reading Jeff Foster as well, and going to his live thing as well, which is on Tuesday. And they are both, in a way, representing for me where I feel I'm at as a musical sort of teacher on a spiritual path. And they are, I would say, in a nutshell, and we can't go into it in any more detail, kind of non-duality post non-duality. So they aren't taking you up and up and up and up into transcendence, into the sort of post-creation space, into ultimate sort of the I as absolute self and pure awareness. They're including shadow, and they are allowing the resistance to process to be there as much as process, and not letting things move into shadow, but working in the middle ground. And I sort of see that sort of Wolfson-Roy Hart voice movement therapy as the kind of, it's almost like the encounter work of the sort of, the sort of Gestalt 60s, 70s humanistic therapy movement, Jungian in the case of Wolfson, who had some contact with Jung, that psychological inquiry, as which Jung was trying to bridge with his interest in the I Ching, and his interest in Eastern philosophy as well, and the very highly sophisticated, refined meditation schools and techniques and musical traditions, which have offered this exquisite musical space. And I've worked with Indian masters, and there's a lot to be received from the power and the tradition that they're holding and that they've picked up from their previous generations of teachers, and that goes back as an oral tradition for thousands of years. And I can also see, in my sort of slightly post modern way, that there's a lot of stuff there that's not being looked at for them as human beings, the attitude to women, and that goes for quite a lot of spiritual practice teachers, and the almost the sacrifice of our vulnerability for the perfection of the form. And I'm like, I won't do that. I won't allow that to be where I end up. I'm going to take it all with us. I want to take the whole person. And that may mean that the art isn't quite as profound or as perfected, but it may mean that we end up in a place where we haven't abandoned parts of ourselves, and we have opened to our resistances and allowed them to be met and held. And I do think if we're looking at healthiness, wholeness, we get to a place where it's not, is it really worth sacrificial effort, or would you rather stay true to the hidden voices, the hidden parts of you, the hidden sensations? And they are, I believe, holding an even deeper secret that may not have found a channel yet out into culture. Because, as Matt Licata says so fantastically, it's too high voltage. It's too high voltage. And yet there is this high voltage truth that has yet to find a meaningful expression in voice, in art even. I'm not sure what I'm saying now, but that's where I've ended up as I think about this. And I'm going to leave it there.